Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Today we're going to look at what things should be wisely contemplated. And this is based on the Sīlavanta Sutta, also known as the Sīla Sutta, and it's in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 122. On Vesak Dhamma session, we actually went through briefly this sutta and a short meditation. So in this session, we're actually going to take an extended look at the teaching that was discussed between Venerable Mahakotthita and Venerable Sariputta. What we'll cover in this session is an introduction to the sutta itself, look at the architecture and just the general information around this sutta. Then we'll go into the importance and benefits of why we want to learn this teaching and this particular contemplation, and then draw on some parallels to other suttas. Then we'll get right into the heart of this sutta, which is the question of what things should be wisely contemplated by a virtuous one. And then the answer is really looking at the 5 aggregates subject to clinging and also the 11 characteristics. And following on from that, we'll look at the different ways we can meditate on this sutta. And then lastly, just a short form of a meditation as well. So let's begin. The Sīlavanta Sutta is actually a very important teaching when it comes to yoniso manasikāra, or wisely directing the mind or wise contemplation. In fact, it's actually one of the most powerful teachings with respect to yoniso manasikāra. In this sutta, we have Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahakotthita coming together to discuss Dhamma. As we know, Venerable Sariputta was known as one of the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha, and Buddha also declared him the foremost of the monk disciples with great wisdom. And we also know that Venerable Sariputta had the analytical knowledges as well. And then we have Venerable Mahakotthita. He was stated by the Buddha as the foremost of the monk disciples who had attained the analytical knowledges, so the Patisambhida. So here we have 2 very, very great arahants, both with the analytical knowledges and both with a lot of wisdom. And they would often come together to discuss Dhamma. So when you go through the Sutta Pitaka, there's quite often dialogue between Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahakotthita. Now, they used to discuss the Dhamma using a question and answers type of instructive style. And it wasn't because they hadn't finished the job in terms of their own attainments or that there was a pressing need to actually discuss Dhamma. It was actually this way because it was a form of instructing the monks and nuns at the time. And so it's clearly for the benefit of others. And seeing this in the Sutta Pitaka, we get to benefit as well from how they had this dialogue. Before launching into the detail of the sutta, it's always good to take a bird's eye view, and we can do this by looking at the architecture of the sutta. So there's only about 9 paragraphs to this sutta. And in the first paragraph, it's just the opening of where Venerable Mahakotthita and Venerable Sariputta are actually residing. And then it just opens with the question that Venerable Mahakotthita poses to Venerable Sariputta, which is what a virtuous monk should wisely contemplate. And then in the second paragraph, Venerable Sariputta gives the answer specifically for what a virtuous monk should wisely contemplate. And then when you have the third sort of segment of the sutta, it's paragraphs 3 to 7, you have the same answer each time Venerable Mahakotthita asks about what a stream enterer, a once returner, and a non-returner should contemplate, wisely contemplate. And the same kind of answer. And then you get to the last 2 paragraphs, which is around the question of what an arahant should wisely contemplate. And you get a slightly different answer, although the contemplation is exactly the same, but there's additional comments to that. And so this is actually a very powerful contemplation when you look at the fact that it touches on the very same answer for a virtuous one, a stream enterer, a once returner, a non-returner, and an arahant. So one can actually complete the path using this contemplation. Before launching into the detail behind the contemplation and the answer given by Venerable Sariputta, it's good to actually look at the importance and benefits of this teaching. One of the most important things about this sutta is around wise contemplation, or yoniso manasikāra. That when you wisely contemplate on the component parts in this teaching, it enables the arising of right view. So as we know from the suttas, that there are two conditions for the arising of right view. The first one is parato goso, which is hearing another's words. And in the case of leading to right view, it's the Buddha's words and those of the noble arahants. And then when it comes to the second condition, it's yoniso manasikāra, which is this wise contemplation. And really, yoniso manasikāra is directing the mind in the right way, the way that leads to the Noble Eightfold Path. And that's why right view arises, because right view leads the Noble Eightfold Path. So when you contemplate wisely, such as in this particular teaching, right view will arise, and once it's arisen, it will grow. And that causes the arising of the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you keep contemplating in that way, then the Noble Eightfold Path goes to fulfillment through the development. And as we know, when you look at the 3 stages of insight and the different parts to the Four Noble Truths, you know that dukkha must be understood. You know that tanha, or craving, must be abandoned. The cessation of suffering, nirodha, must be realized, and the way leading out of suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, must be developed. So when we do any type of wise contemplation, yoniso manasikāra, then we are activating the Noble Eightfold Path. And the more we do these meditations, then what you find is that the Noble Eightfold Path grows and eventually goes to fulfillment. And one of the things that we learn in doing yoniso manasikāra is that we need to apply the Buddha's medicine, or the reminders that the noble arahants give us towards the Buddha's medicine. And so when we redirect our mind using this medicine, we reactivate or activate the right view. And so that's quite key. Now when we activate right view, it leads the Noble Eightfold Path, and so what unfolds is the right intention. So you have the intention for renunciation, for non-ill will, for non-covetousness, which leads to right speech, right action, right livelihood. So that's our foundational sila that supports the Noble Eightfold Path. We make right effort, particularly right effort towards yoniso manasikāra. It doesn't just stop with the contemplation. You keep making effort towards it and reactivating the right view when you veer off. And then right mindfulness to maintain it. And then right concentration, you get to samma samadhi. And then, of course, once you do that, if you keep, developing this higher wisdom, higher concentration, higher sila, higher virtue, then it leads to higher knowledge and ultimately the right liberation, so the vimuktis. Now the opposing thing is true as well. So if you don't listen to Buddha's words, you listen to conventional things, you don't have the answer of the way out of suffering, and you contemplate unwisely, then you start off with the wrong view. And so basically what unfolds is the wrong path, and therefore wrong knowledge and wrong liberation. So ultimately that means that you stay in samsara. You keep transmigrating from birth to birth with no end to dukkha. So it's quite key to actually make sure that one follows the Buddha's instructions and then contemplates wisely, carefully directing the mind towards the Noble Eightfold Path. So it becomes very important to know the distinction between ayoniso manasikāra, so unwise contemplation, and yoniso manasikāra, which is the wise contemplation. Because if you unwisely contemplate, that means you veer off the path that the Buddha has set out, and you go off in a different direction, then that's not conducive to spiritual progress or development. Instead, it's conducive to decline or falling off, what the Buddha terms hānabhāgyo. In contrast, if one wisely contemplates, and especially follows the Buddha's instructions, then what happens is it leads to distinction or progress. And in this case, when we're looking at the Sīlavanta Sutta, these contemplations may not be something that has been done before. You're not familiar with them, not familiar with following sutta meditations. But it's important to actually acknowledge that and to have an open mind towards actually looking at how these contemplations are done, because they ultimately lead to right view and to the right practice of the path. Now, the other thing that may arise is resistance, that really what these meditations do is they help to unshackle you. And as we saw at the beginning, these are the contemplations that are going to help you to enter the stream and to develop further. And so that's one of the things to notice when you try to start meditating in this way, to contemplate in this way, that there may be quite deep resistance that arises where you just want to turn away from it. But the thing is, what you're actually turning away from is really leaning towards Nibbana, and what you're turning to and habitually turning to is really wanting to stay in samsara, which means you want to stay in suffering. And so it's important to acknowledge that maybe this is not something that has been done before. And if that is the case, then know that there will probably be resistance in trying to attempt some of these contemplations. But if you can overcome the resistance, the wanting to turn away from the Buddha's words, then when you overcome it, you realize actually there is an opportunity to unshackle oneself from samsara and to the whole mass of suffering. And that is a really amazing thing. So back to this particular sutta and the dialogue between Venerable Mahakotthita and Venerable Sariputta. And Venerable Mahakotthita is the one that continuously asks Venerable Sariputta the question, what things should a virtuous monk carefully or wisely contemplate? Then he also asks, what should a stream enterer carefully or wisely contemplate? And then he asks further, what should a once returner carefully or wisely contemplate? And then what should a non-returner carefully and wisely contemplate? And the last one is, what should an arahant wisely contemplate? And it's interesting because at each answer, so for a virtuous mendicant, if you contemplate in accordance with this sutta, if you do this sutta meditation, and it's possible, Venerable Sariputta says, for someone to realize the fruit of stream entry. And then when Venerable Mahakotthita asks about a stream enterer, what they should wisely contemplate, it's the exact same sutta meditation. And Venerable Sariputta basically says that it's possible for the stream enterer to realize the fruit of once return by contemplating in this way. And then for a once returner, when Venerable Mahakotthita asks about that, Venerable Sariputta says, well, it's possible for the once returner to realize the fruit of non-return. And then for the non-returner, when the question is asked what to wisely contemplate, Venerable Sariputta says, well, if you contemplate in this way, one can realize arahantship. And then lastly, Venerable Mahakotthita asks about the arahant, that if the arahant is to wisely contemplate, which is yoniso manasikāra, Venerable Sariputta then answers that although nothing more needs to be done and there's no further improvement because the arahant is basically fully awakened, but the answer is still the same, that wise contemplation is the exact same instruction that is given in this sutta. And that when the arahant does this, it's because that when you develop and cultivate wise attention in this way, it leads to what is known as ditta dhamma sukha vihara. And that means pleasant dwelling in the present life. And then the second reason is also for sati sampajanya, which is mindfulness and clear comprehension. And so in this way, what you realize from this dialogue between Venerable Mahakotthita and Venerable Sariputta is that this particular meditation is something, firstly, if you keep practicing it and you fully develop it and cultivate it, it actually leads to bearing much fruit. And once it bears fruit, one can still continue to do it, because an arahant, although they have finished the job, finished the task, They're fully awakened for the rest of their life till parinibbana. This is keeping the mind in a very pleasant place, and also to have that almost like clear vision, as opposed to getting not swept up in the world for an arahant, but just swayed by conditions in terms of discomfort probably. So this sutta is very, very powerful when you consider these particular fruits that can arise, their possibilities if one starts to develop, perfect this particular contemplation in the Sīlavanta Sutta. Now it's also very good to just quickly pull up the Avijja Sutta that we've covered before, because it's just to know that in the Avijja Sutta it gives the insight pathways on the unwholesome side, which is on the left-hand side, and then for the wholesome side, the kusala side, which is on the right-hand side. And so you see where yoniso manasikāra, this wise contemplation, sits. It comes after associating with good people, people that are walking the Noble Eightfold Path, as well as the Buddha and the Noble Arahants, their words, their teachings, because then you hear the true Dhamma. These good people are always promoting Buddha's words, or Buddha is actually telling us, giving us instructions around true Dhamma. And so then when that happens, conviction or saddha, faith, confidence in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha arises, but particularly conviction and confidence towards the Buddha. And then when that arises, then you understand what needs to be done, and so you wisely contemplate in accordance with the Buddha's teachings. From there, the rest of the insight pathway is really the practice in accordance with the teachings. So as a result of wise contemplation, mindfulness and clear comprehension comes to be. When that comes to be, one understands why sense restraint is very important. There's an example that one can give. Like when you tighten a bolt using a nut and bolt, when you try and unshackle, a bit like trying to unshackle from samsara, you slowly release the nut. And what you do is you gently kind of unscrew it. And so part of yoniso manasikāra, this wise contemplation, is gently doing that, letting it come to release itself. And that's what we're trying to do. It won't be fully released until we fully perfect the path. But as we develop the practice, we're trying to actually release it gently and gradually. And so mindfulness and clear comprehension comes to be because at that point, you're mindful and you have this understanding that you don't want to tighten that bolt again. You don't want to tighten it so that you have to start from scratch again, that you veer off the path, so to speak, using this analogy of the nun bolt. If you tighten it again, you're reshackling yourself to samsara. And so mindfulness and clear comprehension is really knowing that you want to stay on the right track. That once you've directed the mind using wise contemplation, wise direction of the mind towards right view, you use mindfulness and clear comprehension not to veer off, that you attend to it at that point. And knowing that restraint of the sense faculties, indriya samvara, is like your security guard to make sure that you stay on the path and you don't make contact with things that are unwise, unskillful, unwholesome. And therefore, to support the path, you cultivate the 3 kinds of good conduct. So through body, speech and mind, that supports the Noble Eightfold Path. And then after that, you develop the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So you know that you don't want to be enticed by beauty, by temporary happiness, by things that are not going to last, and also things that are not worth taking as me and mine. So that's where your 4 establishments of mindfulness are setting in. So this is the satipatthana. And from there, you also use yoniso manasikāra again, this wise contemplation, to activate the bojjhangas, the 7 factors of enlightenment. And so the other wings of awakening help there too. So there'll be like the spiritual faculties, the powers, and so on and so forth. And so they all come together to ultimately lead you to true knowledge and liberation, which is this vijja vimutti. So in contrast, on the other side, when you don't associate with good people, You don't necessarily hear the Buddha's words, you don't heed them. And even if you do hear them, you may ignore them. And so when that happens, there's a definite lack of conviction or confidence. And when that happens, then you're very unlikely to have wise contemplation. Instead, you have unwise contemplation. As a result of that, you will have a lack of mindfulness and clear comprehension. And for those that are practicing, it's the wrong kind of mindfulness and comprehension. And therefore, what you may notice is that there is no conviction towards having sense restraint. You would have no reason for it. And therefore, you're not that terribly concerned about conduct. Instead, misconduct might abound. And where you tend to abide is in the 5 hindrances. So instead of cultivating the satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and instead of cultivating the bojjhangas, instead you're actually abiding with the hindrances, so sensual desire, ill will, a lot of dullness and drowsiness. Quite often it's recognized as dull samadhi instead of sama samadhi, and restlessness and worry, so the mind is very unsettled. And then there's a lot of doubt about the path, doubt about Buddha Dhamma Sangha, doubt about many other things. And so what you breed instead of true knowledge and liberation is you breed ignorance, more ignorance. And so yoniso manasikāra and this particular meditation, this in the Sīlavanta Sutta, is very important and very beneficial to activating the Noble Eightfold Path and developing it towards fulfillment, towards Nibbana. There are definitely some parallels in other suttas, and this gives us confidence that this is a real teaching of the Buddha and something that we can definitely focus on and develop. So I don't want to spend too much time going through these, but there are a number of suttas. The first one is the one directly after the Sīlavanta Sutta. It's known as the Sūttavanta Sutta. And Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahakotthita give exactly the same teaching, but instead of for a virtuous monk, it's for a learned monk. And then you have a couple of suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya, so the middle-length discourses, where the Buddha actually gives these instructions using the same 5 aggregates subject to clinging and the 11 characteristics. And so you can look at this in your own time. And there's also quite a number of suttas regarding the jhanas. The Buddha actually encourages cultivating this particular contemplation while you're activating the jhanas or the mental absorptions. And then lastly, there's also the expansion of these 11 characteristics that we find in the Sīlavanta Sutta. There are actually 29 more that are added to bring it to 40 characteristics that Venerable Sariputta lists out and describes in the Patisambhida Magga, which is the path of discrimination in the minor discourses. So we'll now look at the main part of the teaching, and it's really around this question of what things should be wisely contemplated. Venerable Mahakotthita asked Venerable Sariputta, "Reverend Sariputta, what things should a virtuous mendicant wisely contemplate?" And Venerable Sariputta responds, "Reverend Kotthita, a virtuous mendicant should wisely contemplate the 5 aggregates subject to clinging as impermanent, suffering, a sickness, a tumour, a dart, misery, an affliction, alien, disintegrating, empty, not me or mine." What 5? That is, the aggregate subject to clinging of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. It's possible that a virtuous mendicant who regards the 5 aggregates subject to clinging in this way will realize the fruit of stream entry. So as we know, when Venerable Mahakotthita keeps asking about each of the stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arahant, he gives exactly the same answer, except for the arahant at the end. He gives slightly more about ditta dhamma sukha vihara and also about sati sampajanya. So let's look at the components of what we need to contemplate. In order to do this contemplation, it's always important to understand the context for the contemplation. because there is a context. And if you remember the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is the first discourse or the first teaching of the Buddha, he gives these terms when he talks about the First Noble Truth. And in many ways, when you look at all the contemplations that Buddha gives us and the Noble Arahants give us in the suttas, they all come back to this first teaching of the Buddha. And what we are trying to do in learning the meditations, learning the true Dhamma, is to actually understand the Four Noble Truths and to develop the 12 insights according to the Four Noble Truths. And so the context for this contemplation, which applies to all other meditations of the Buddha, is that there is birth, there is aging, there is sickness, there is death. As a result of that, there is pain, sadness, sorrow, lamentation, grief, separation from what is pleasing, and union with what is displeasing. And ultimately, the last term that is used is that we don't get what we want. And of course, the Buddha also includes in dukkha, the First Noble Truth, is that we cling to the Five Aggregates. And so that is the context for where we contemplate. And so we draw on this sequence as we contemplate the Five Aggregates of clinging as 11 characteristics. So when we come to explain each of the characteristics, there are certain parts of this that apply within this context of the First Noble Truth. So the contemplation that we need to do involves the 5 aggregates subject to clinging, so pancha upadana khandas. And so the first one we have is rupa upadana khanda, which is form subject to clinging. Then we have vedana upadana khanda, which is feeling subject to clinging. Then we have sañña upadana khanda, which is perception due to clinging or subject to clinging. And then we have sankhara upadana khanda, which is volitional formation subject to clinging. Then we have viññāna upadana khanda, which is consciousness subject to clinging. So we'll look in a little bit more detail about that. Then the 11 characteristics that we need to contemplate them as is aniccato, which is impermanent, dukkhato, which is suffering, rogato, which is sickness, gandato, which is tumour, sallato, which is dart, aghato, which is misery, ābādhato, which is affliction, parato, which is alien, palokato, which is disintegrating, suññato, which is empty, and anattato, which is not me or mine or not self. Now, it's very good to know the Pali words for these because in many ways to do the meditation and to practice it frequently, you need to memorize. I'd recommend writing them down in sequence. So remembering them in Pali is very helpful because you go aniccato, dukkhato, rogato, gandato, sallato, aghato, ābādhato, parato, palokato, suññato, and anattato. And you can go backwards as well as a meditation. But essentially, these 11 characteristics, they are an expanded form of the 3 characteristics that we know as anicca, dukkha, anatta. So if you look at the color coding, the orange relate to those that are anicca. The yellow all are contemplations of dukkha, and the green are all contemplations of anatta. And this is supported by the suttas and also in the Patisambhidamagga that in particular Venerable Sariputta actually says which ones go for which contemplation. So what this does when we look at it as 11 characteristics is help us to truly understand the 3 characteristics that the Buddha always talks about. Because Buddha always asks us, is it anicca? And we give an answer. Is it dukkha? We give an answer. And is it anatta? And we give an answer. And what helps is that these 11 characteristics, when you start to contemplate them, they really get to the root of anicca, dukkha, anatta. And there's a very good meditation that can come out of it that is a more shorter version of this meditation. Because when you look at what the sutta says, you're meant to contemplate each of the aggregate subject to clinging. So each one by 11. as these 11 terms or these 11 characteristics. So 5 by 11 gives you a minimum of 55 meditations or contemplations. If you then also look at how we usually think, so the ayoniso manasikāra side of it, then you have 5 by another 11. And so essentially there is 110 at that point in terms of contemplations. But there are many other contemplations that you can do in addition to that. So it can get quite complicated. But essentially, you're meant to do 5 by 11 at the very least for yoniso manasikāra. And when you do that, it's not that easy when you actually attempt to go through each aggregate subject to clinging as the 11. And it takes some time as well. But it's a very worthwhile and beneficial meditation, because if you get very good at it, then you keep developing the fruit of the path. And so there is incentive towards that. I mean, as a minimum, for any worldling who takes refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, the thing that you really do want to attain is the fruit of stream entry. Because when you have path and fruit of stream entry, then you know that you are somewhat safe from lower realms, and there is a massive reduction in suffering that one can expect. And so that is really the goal if one has one on the spiritual path, particularly on the Buddha's spiritual path, the path to Nibbana. To do this contemplation, it's very important that we understand what the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are. When you go to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Buddha talks about the First Noble Truth and that we cling to these 5 aggregates. And as a result, we experience the First Noble Truth, which is suffering. And at the same time, we also understand that when we misapprehend these 5 aggregates, that's why we cling. And what happens is that we can keep wanting to come back when we misapprehend, or we have the corruption in our minds towards these 5 aggregates. And so it's good to know what they are, and so we'll go through that right now. In order to do the meditation, it's important to know what the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are, and in particular the 5 aggregates in general. And there are many suttas where the Buddha and the Noble Arahants give teachings on these things. And in relation to the 5 aggregates in particular, there's a whole collection of teachings that's gathered in chapter 22 of the Samyutta Nikaya. And of course there are other teachings in the numerical discourses and middle-length discourses and longer discourses. But there's one in particular, the Upadana Paripavatta Sutta, and that's in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 56. And it gives us a little bit more about the 5 aggregates which are subject to clinging. So the aggregates subject to clinging are form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. So in relation to form is really the 4 great elements. So earth, air, water, fire. And it arises due to nutriment. And what we understand is that all sentient beings exist due to conditions. And so in relation to form, it arises due to nutriment. In relation to feeling, there are 6 classes of feeling. So feeling born of eye contact, nose contact, ear contact, tongue contact, bodily contact, and mental contact or mind contact. And then perception. Again, this is 6 classes, and perception due to forms, due to sounds, due to tastes, due to smells, due to tactile objects, and to mental objects. And so contact again causes the arising of these things, just like feelings. And then when it comes to volitional formations, this is really volition, again in 6 classes, due to forms, due to sounds, due to taste, due to smells, due to tactile objects, and then also due to mental objects. And then lastly, with consciousness, again, there are 6 classes. And in this case, it's like eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. And really, consciousness arises due to name and form, nama rupa. And so these are the reasons why we think we are. and who we think we are, and how we also think others are as well. We get caught up and misapprehend these five aggregates. And when we misapprehend, that's where we cling. And that's where we desire to create another five aggregates in the future, thinking that there's nothing wrong with that. But we don't see the First Noble Truth and how it's related to these five aggregates of clinging. And in this meditation, what we're going to do is to correct that misapprehension by contemplating them as these 11 characteristics. Now we come to the 11 characteristics, and it's important to know what each of these characteristics are, because we're going to be looking in the contemplation at the five aggregates subject to clinging as these 11 characteristics. Now, a gentle reminder that if you haven't contemplated this in this way before, then it may feel like you don't want to contemplate in this way. And it's easier because the other meditations you've done before are simply to stop the mind. But as we know from yoniso manasikāra, in order to get to the right view, to activate the Noble Eightfold Path, one needs to actually wisely contemplate, wisely direct the mind. And in this particular meditation, what we're contemplating is the five aggregates subject to clinging as these 11 characteristics. And when we do so, what's very evident is that we start to unshackle or unfetter ourselves from samsara, from this conventional, constructed, conditioned world. When the resistance arises, what you need to understand is that the resistance is not wanting to be unshackled, not wanting to be liberated. But if you almost like put some energy towards resisting the resistance, as in pushing forward, pushing through the concrete bunker, pushing through the door bar, which is this overarching ignorance that we all have, then you get a chance to actually start to move in the direction that will unfetter towards nibbana. And that's the only way one can do it. If you still the mind and abide, then that doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to free yourself. It's only by wise contemplation that one gets to true knowledge, true wisdom, and then to true liberation. So the first characteristic is aniccato. So of course it's a contemplation of anicca. So it can be translated as impermanent, unlasting, subject to arising and passing away, unreliable, unstable. So what this really means, if you refer back to the context for the contemplation, to all contemplations of the Buddha, we refer back to birth, aging, sickness and death. When we refer back to that, this makes sense that if we are born, then we are subject to old age, sickness and death. That means there is an arising and then there is a passing away. And when we experience rebirth, it begins all over again. We are arising and then we pass away. And the other terms that we looked at subsequent to death is pain, sadness, sorrow, lamentation, grief, separation from what is pleasing, union with what is displeasing. That is the whole mass of dukkha, the whole mass of suffering, that when you are born and you experience old age, sickness and death, then you are also subject to all of the rest of it as well. So this applies to all of the five aggregates, so form, feeling, perception, volitional formations and consciousness. And the sutta meditation that's very helpful for seeing aniccato is actually the Samadhi Bhavana Sutta. That's also in the chapter 22 of the Samyutta Nikaya, and it's discourse number 5. And it's because we take delight, welcome, remain holding. It is out of tanha, craving, that we have this misapprehension. And because of that, we take delight, we cling, and then we want to come to exist again, and therefore we birth. With birth comes old age and death, and then the whole mess of suffering, then it starts again. We never correct or uproot the ignorance, the taints. And so when we are able to contemplate aniccato against the five aggregates subject to clinging, it's very, very powerful. The second characteristic is dukkhato. So this is suffering, pain, unsatisfactory or unsatisfying. And this characteristic, of course, is the contemplation of dukkha. And when we look at this, it's more than just the feeling of suffering or the feeling of pain. In actual fact, the contemplation, when you look at dukkhato, is about birth is dukkha, old age is dukkha, or the aging is dukkha, sickness is dukkha, and death is dukkha. Again, the context is very important because yes, unhappy feelings arise, but it's due to the process that if we are born, then we are subject to aging, sickness, and death. We can't get away from it. And so the whole mass of suffering, whether it's pain, sadness, sorrow, grief, lamentation, all of it, separation from our loved, things that are pleasing, and united with what is not pleasing. And that is what we can expect. So when you investigate the five aggregates subject to clinging, one can actually see that. Then we come to the third characteristic, which is rogato, which is translated as sickness, disease, illness. And it is one of the things that we can look at the bodily level, definitely that, we do get sick. And there's constantly some kind of illness within us, even though we may not know. And Buddha says that there are going to be many illnesses as time passes, some that will not even have names. Now, when it comes to mental illness, we also can experience that as well. And so when you look at the five aggregates, you can break that down into bodily illness and mental illness and actually contemplate in that way. And when you think about even how the Buddha actually talks about illness, at a physical level, the Buddha talks about hunger and thirst, having to urinate, defecate, having to maintain this body. All kinds of things are needed in order to do that. And yet we still become sick because we have the nature to sicken actually. So this is part of the contemplation of dukkha. And then we come to the fourth characteristic, which is gandato, which is translated as tumor, boil, swelling. And gandato is again a contemplation of dukkha. And really when you think about what we are subject to with this body, what everything leads to is death at the bodily level. And even at the mental level, whatever arises passes away. And so there's a kind of cancer or tumor that exists in our very existence that needs to be understood. Another way of looking at it as well is that it spreads like a wound, that, we don't want certain things to spread, but they do at a bodily and mental level. And it all leads to death. Everything is death-bound. When we cling to the five aggregates, it's like a death trap. And even with defilements, one can look at it through defilements like derogation, disparaging, envy, all these sorts of things. They tend to fester and spread like a tumor, spread like a cancer. And in that way you can understand the mental side of it. And these are the things that we're trying to actually subdue and abandon. So the fifth characteristic is sallato, also translated as dart, arrow, and therefore piercing, stabbing. And this relates to nutriments actually, because the Buddha says that all beings are sustained by nutriment. And so when we're sustained by nutriment, being physical nutriment, so kabbalinkara hara, contact as nutriment, phassa hara, mental volition as nutriment, mano sancetana hara, and the last one is consciousness as nutriment, viññāna hara, then when we keep feeding via these nutriments, what happens is different suttas, different darts enter the mind. So the four darts that wedge in our minds based on these four nutriments are, in the case of physical nutriment, it's lust, so raga salla. In the case of contact as nutriment, so what wedges in the mind is dosa salla, so hate. When it comes to the mental volition as nutriment, what wedges in the mind is ditthi-salla, so views. And lastly, with consciousness as nutriment, what wedges in the mind is moha-salla, which is delusion. So when we have these wedged in the mind, what happens is that consciousness tends to steady in that place. And so when it comes to burning with lust, like the dart of lust, what we do is we hold on to form. And so we keep burning with lust and we keep going and looping in that way. And in terms of contact as nutriment, when we burn with hate, what happens is we're holding on to the feeling of it. Likewise, with mental volition as nutriment, we burn with views, and so we're holding on to the perception of our views. And then with consciousness as nutriment, what we do is we burn with delusion, and so we're holding on to the volitional formations, what we construct in our minds, the stories, the fabrications. And what we know from dependent origination is that consciousness is constructed out of volitional formations. So volitional formations are the condition for consciousness to arise. And of course, ignorance is the condition for volitional formations to arise. Now, essentially what we're saying is that when consciousness is arisen, then the paticca samuppada continues. Then we have name and form. Name and form conditions the six sense bases or six sense fields. That in turn conditions contact. Contact then conditions feeling. Feeling then conditions craving. Craving conditions clinging. Clinging conditions coming to existence. With coming to exist, then there is birth. Then birth means old age and death. And then we have the whole mass of suffering again. And so we go through that over and over again, birth to more birth. And so if we don't uproot ignorance, then we are constantly afflicted by these darts. And so that is what we need to contemplate when it comes to the five aggregates subject to clinging, is this sallato, these darts which keep piercing the mind. And so then we come to the sixth characteristic, which is aghato. And aghato is known as misery or grief. And there's a sutta called the Aghamulla Sutta. And in this sutta, the question is asked is, what is misery? And the answer that's given by the Buddha is the five aggregates are misery. And in addition to that, the root of misery, the answer is given that the root of misery is tanha, craving to come to exist. So when you look at the five aggregates subject to clinging as misery, you look at it from a physical level, that we are physically, it's an extension of dukkha in the sense that we are miserable due to external elements, so climate and physical challenges and all those sorts of things. But we're also challenged by people. Misery comes due to relationships and circumstances, the ripening of karma. There are also mental misery, which comes from mental torment, stress, disturbances. And quite often what happens with most of these things associated with dukkha is we deny it. We deny that it exists, and most of the time we trick ourselves to blank out the dukkha or the misery that we go through. And it's only when there's extreme situations such as terminal illness, old age, very old age and fragility, and even when it comes to, someone dying, someone that we love, someone that we know dies, in these extreme situations, we see the misery. But soon after, once it passes, we forget. But the misery is always still there. And so we need to contemplate at the bodily level and mental level through the five aggregates subject to clinging this misery as a contemplation of dukkha. So then we come to the seventh characteristic, which is ābādhato, which is affliction, disease, oppression. And ābādhato is also at a bodily and mental level. And one could see it as even reflecting on the aging process. The aging process brings with it much physical affliction. And what we try to do again is to deny it. But there's a point where you can not or no longer deny these things, when your balance is no longer the same, when your taste buds no longer work as well, when your hearing starts to go, when your aches and pains start to remind you of this process. And then when it comes to physical challenges, we may have disabilities and other sorts of things, injuries that we have to bear with. And so ābādhato actually looks at that. And in the mental sense, we always are afflicted. We're afflicted with all kinds of views, perceptions, biases, prejudices, stress, disabilities, mental illness, all kinds of things. And it's important when we reflect, particularly when we contemplate them in relation to the five aggregates subject to clinging, that we register and acknowledge them. And in our daily lives as well, we can do this too, to register that they are there at times and that they do exist, rather than trying to patch it up, trying to forget and blank them out. Because the truth is that they are ongoing and they are part of the aging process. And we get very sorrowful about it, but we deny even that. But deep down, there is a deep sorrow that comes with this affliction. So the eighth characteristic is parato, and it's usually translated as alien. And para normally means others. And a good way of trying to understand this is to look in the Patisambhidamagga, and Venerable Sariputta has this word for nibbana as aparapachayang, which means not relying on others. And so parato is really about relying on others, having this dependency on others. And so at a bodily level, we don't often see it because we're socially conventioned to create lives or existence that is somewhat independent. But when you look at examples such as the food chain, that even if we have a lot of money, we're still dependent on others for food. That no matter whether one tries to be self-sufficient at home, there's still a process within which we need to obtain goods and services from others for more than what we can personally grow or create ourselves. So when you look at it that way, when you look at the food chain, we go to a shop. That shop buys from someone else, a distributor, a wholesaler. There are lots of logistics involved with the transportation of food, the distribution of food. It goes back towards farmers. Even with farmers, there are workers. Even with workers, there are insects involved in that process, creatures that we can't even fathom or see. And so when you look at it that way, then you see the reliance. Even when you look at the monastic sangha relies on lay people for requisites, even within their convention. Then if you look at a deeper level, you look at the mental phenomena. You start with consciousness. And if you hold out your hand and you look at your thumb being consciousness, and you touch your forefinger, that's form. Consciousness relies on form in order to construct. Then when you tap your thumb to your middle finger, that's feeling. Consciousness constructs feelings. Then when you touch your ring finger with your thumb, that's perception. Consciousness is steadying on perceptions in order to construct. And then the last one is your little finger. When the thumb meets that is consciousness constructing out of volitional formations. And of course, volitional formations is that higher link in the Paticcasamuppada, the dependent origination. So you see that in order to construct the sense of me, the sense of mine, one constructs through these five aggregates. And of course, our whole existence comes to be because of volitional formations, and that's fed by ignorance. So there's a reliance in the whole process to construct whatever is conditioned. And so there's a fatal flaw in this. And so when we look at this is really a contemplation of anatta, that there is no me or mine without this construction. And so there's something very deep to contemplate here when you look at the five aggregates through this characteristic. So then we come to palokato, which is translated as disintegrating. It can also mean breaking off, dissolution, decay. And it's a contemplation of anicca, so a contemplation of impermanence or unlastingness. And the way we can look at this is really to see everything is disintegrating. There's a very good sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 35, discourse number 84. It's called the Palokato Sutta. And Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha to explain Palokadhamma. And so the Buddha was actually saying that what disintegrates is all the sense bases disintegrate. And he goes on to say that all the sense objects disintegrate, and the sense consciousness disintegrates, and the sense contact disintegrates. So everything that we believe in is actually death-bound and disintegrating. We just don't see that. And so Buddha is really challenging us, and of course Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahakotthita in this particular sutta, that we need to investigate these five aggregates, because this is really where the ear, eyes, nose, tongue, body and mind get formulated. And it's our most valued product, our most valued thing when it comes to existence. And so we refuse to see the disintegration. We refuse to see the decaying process. Even with aging, we keep using all these products in order to stem the tide, to use makeup and hair things and dyes and all kinds of things, surgery even, in order to almost like combat the decaying process. And it's impossible to do, yet we still try and do that. And conventionally it's condoned, because we're not allowed to age, we're not allowed to see the disintegrating process. And even in death, we're not allowed to see the body breaking down. Usually dead bodies are made up, made to look as if they were normal, or as in as close to nice as possible. And the disintegration process of the body is not allowed to be seen, as the earth element starts to crumble, as of course the air has left, the life force has left, but the water that seeps out of the body, whether it's blood, pus, mucus, whatever it is, as it seeps out of the body, and then of course the heat goes. So Palokadhamma is actually a very powerful way of looking at the five aggregates, because even at a mind and bodily level, it can be seen. And this is the thing that we refuse to see. So if we can penetrate it, then it's very useful, because the opposite of it is that we get very distressed when another person starts to decay, starts to grow old, decay, and eventually die. Likewise for ourselves, it's very distressing to be confronted with that process. And so when it comes to all the things that we do to stem the tide, from makeup to creams to clothing to jewelry to surgery and more. And so it's very confronting, but I think in meditation, when you wisely contemplate, it's very important to see how the mind is through all these characteristics. What is the mind like before you contemplate in this way? And what is the mind like when you really contemplate with yoniso manasikāra wisely, in accordance with these characteristics? Because you will notice the difference. The question to ask is the mind settled? Does the mind gladden? Does the mind concentrate? Does the mind become more easeful when you contemplate these characteristics, which is really about truth? That when you give the mind truth, what you really need to rejoice in the meditation is the fact that you are actually abiding with truth and you are leaning towards Nibbana. And that's the thing with all these meditations that the Buddha gives us, that the Noble Arahants give us. It's to notice the difference between ayoniso, the unwise part, and the wise part. The 10th characteristic is suññato, or empty, also known as void, unsubstantial, devoid of reality. And it's another contemplation of anatta, so not me or mine, and not self. So the best way to actually contemplate this is through a series of questions that the Buddha normally asks in the suttas. And you find this in the middle-length discourses. You also find it in the numerical and connected discourses. The question that Buddha normally asks the monks is it permanent in relation to the five aggregates? He'll also then ask, is it suffering? And then he'll ask, is it subject to change? And then he'll ask, is it me or mine? Is it not self? Or really empty of self, empty of things belonging to self? So the best way to reflect in a similar way to the questions that the Buddha asks is this contemplation. So the contemplation is really, if it is impermanent, so that means we see that with birth there's subject to aging, sickness and death. So, arising and passing away. So there's nothing that lasts because there's arising and passing away. We go from rebirth to rebirth. And then it is suffering or painful. So this process that we go through is a dukkha process, death-bound process and painful process. And subject to change, so viparinama. So as you can see with aging, there is, the change that is happening and then eventually death. And then the question you ask after reflecting in this way is it worth taking as me and mine? So essentially we're saying, if it is anicca, impermanent, if it is suffering, dukkha, and subject to change, viparinama, is it worth taking as me and mine? And so when you meditate and contemplate in this way, and this applies to the five aggregates subject to clinging, then if it's not worth taking as me and mine, if it's not substantial, if it's not real and true, if it's really empty, then it's not worth taking as me and mine. And so what you see at that point, that you're not in control of this process, and therefore you see it as empty. That's the answer one would see in your meditation. If you get the correct answer in your meditation, then one goes to the fourth jhana. If you frequently practice this, you can go to the seventh jhana. So it's a very powerful meditation to actually see suññato, empty, in this way. So as you can see, we've been building these characteristics one by one, and where it culminates in is ābādhato. So this is the 11th characteristic of not self or not me or mine. And so this is like empty of self, empty of anything belonging to self. And again, this is not easy to see just by contemplating it off the cuff. It really is connected to the last characteristic of number 10, which is suññato, empty. Because when you see it as empty, what you're really seeing when you do that particular contemplation, that if it is impermanent, is painful or suffering and subject to change, and you see that it's not worth taking as mine, then what you see is that actually these five aggregates of clinging in your meditation, you see it is empty of self. It's empty of anything that belongs to self. And so it is not me or mine. You see that it is hollow. There's nothing of value there, even though you thought it was. And you take on board all the other 10 characteristics, really. It all is all embedded within the wisdom that you contemplate this 11th characteristic. Because this process that we call life is always separation from what is pleasing. And we're always united with what is displeasing. So what we want is a permanent self that lasts, a permanent self that experiences all the beauty in the world and has long-lasting happiness. But what is reality for us is really that everything is conditioned and constructed. And so we are constantly separated from what is pleasing. We only get temporary happiness. What is beautiful when we investigate is really not that beautiful, especially once we cling to it and have expectations around it. And it doesn't last. And so we're united with what is displeasing each and every time. And so why regard it as me and mine? So this is the 11th characteristic that we look at. Now, having looked at the component parts of the contemplation, we can put that all together and look at the different ways we can meditate on this sutta. The first thing is really the instructions in this sutta, yoniso manasikāra, about these 5 aggregates subject to clinging as the 11 characteristics. So the way you meditate is you take form as subject to clinging, and you look at aniccato, and you spend some time contemplating, and then you go to dukkhato. Then after that you spend some time, you go to rogato, all the way to anattato, and you go one by one with form. Then the next thing you do is you take feeling that is subject to clinging, and you go through the 11 characteristics. Then perception, 11 characteristics, and then volitional formation, sankharas, as these 11 characteristics, and then finally consciousness, as you look at these 11 characteristics. It's not an easy meditation, but it's actually very worthwhile if you've understood the characteristics, to then investigate. Because having understood a little bit about the characteristics, the actual insight comes in the meditation. So what we've discussed as the characteristics, it deepens, and it actually increases in terms of wisdom once you contemplate. And if you do so frequently, then you start to unshackle yourself. So please remember that these meditations, there'll be a deep resistance. One that may say, oh, I don't understand, or the second maybe this is too hard, or 3, it's too much thinking, I'm so used to not thinking. But the point is that yoniso manasikāra, wise contemplation, wisely directing the mind, the Buddha says this is very kusala. This is how we unfetter ourselves. And so if we want to enter the stream, if we want to lean towards Nibbana, if we want to actually get out of samsara, then these are the meditations we need to do. Now, it's okay if you don't want to meditate in this way, then just know that it's really not the time for you to unshackle yourself. It's always very cautious. One needs to be very cautious about the type of meditations one does. This one in particular is very liberating, and the mind gets extremely happy and very, very concentrated. And so from that concentration, one can get to ceto vimukti, so the liberation of mind. One can also get to the different panya vimuktis, the different liberation through wisdom. So that's because one is contemplating and getting to right view. So we're no longer abiding with the lies, the falsity of the constructed, the conditioned world. We're actually getting to the root of the truth. So that's something to remember. The other way to do the meditation is actually to again look at the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. So form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, one by one, as the 11 characteristics, but from the way that we have our habitual tendency. So you could call this the yoniso manasikāra side, so the unwise contemplation. What's really good about this is that this also really opens up the mind, because you start to see how we normally think, how we normally unwisely contemplate. Most of the time, like I was saying before, we want to have a permanent self that has long-lasting happiness and can be associated with all the beautiful things. And so when we keep thinking that what we're seeing and what we're experiencing through the body and mind, through the 5 aggregates as such, then we keep being duped by the conditioned, constructed world. And so with all these meditations, you can start from 1 and go to 11. You can start from 11 and go back through to 1. You can do that with the yoniso manasikāra side, and you can do it with the ayoniso manasikāra side. It's quite illuminating to be able to do these meditations backwards and forwards. So in this instance, when we look at this unwise contemplation, this is where we normally reside. We spend a lot of time in this unwise attention, unwise contemplation. We actually think that everything around us is permanent. Now, it seems quite shocking to say that, even though most of us can cognize that there's old age, sickness, and death, we can see unlastingness of even the moments that we have in our lives. you could say, what we experienced before this coronavirus experience, it seemed so permanent, and yet we went into this situation for the past year and a half that is so different that those good times that we thought were good times didn't last. And then when it comes to the dukkha, what we think we experience is happiness. We keep patching up all those times that were good and obliterating from our minds all the times that were bad. Now, when we go through an experience like this coronavirus, it's very hard to actually compel ourselves to believe that. So this is a very good opportunity, a real blessing in order to contemplate, because we can actually see that there is not just happiness. We have to experience most of the time sliding from what we term happiness. And actually it's more of a roller coaster. Then when it comes to health, well, right now we're being challenged. We actually think most of the time that we can maintain good health, but in actual fact, we do go through periods of bad health, sickness, illness, and we see the world right now as such as well. Then when it comes to the fourth characteristic, we don't see the swelling in our bodies and our minds. We don't think that there is a tumor, that there is some kind of illness that is festering within us, because that's what gandato is actually about. And so what we don't actually see, that there is this festering of both mental tumor or cancer that is festering in our minds or in our bodies. And then when it comes to the fifth characteristic, we don't think that there's any dart or anything that is stinging us, piercing us through the five aggregates. We actually think everything is fine, that there's nothing that is troubling us, but there really, really is. And then when it comes to the sixth characteristic, we actually deny the misery, the grief, that we may have experienced, difficult periods in our lives and also death, but and we experience this in our loved ones. But what we do is we reject that, we gloss over, and so we think that there is no misery, there is no mental torment, there is no physical affliction that we go through. And then when it comes to what we termed affliction or disease, we actually also try and patch these things up. So we were using the example of the aging process. Most of the time we deny the aging process, and so it becomes very difficult. But particularly with loved ones, we see this more than within ourselves, where they keep saying, no, I'm fine, no, I'll be okay. No, I'm not getting old, I'm 21 again. And so you see that it's very, very difficult to actually confront the affliction. That when we are yoniso manasikāra, there's a lot of rejection, denial through all the 11 characteristics. And then when it comes to not relying on others, we really try to stay as independent as possible, but it's actually quite futile at the physical level to do so. And at the mental level, it's impossible, because consciousness really does have to rely and steady upon form, feeling, perception and volitional formations in order to construct. That's part of the magic trick that consciousness does for us. Even when we go to very tranquil states, there is a part that is still, until we are fully liberated, there is still trickery. And that's why one doesn't want to crave even jhanas, for example. We may go to the jhanas because Buddha recommends that, rather than the gross kind of delight that one can take in the world. But in terms of true liberation, there's still a trickery going on. It's not sustainable. And it's not worth taking as me and mine. Not to be compelled to think that you're united with something that is eternal. And then when it comes to the disintegrating, we refuse to see it. And that's why when it comes to surgery, creams, makeup, clothing, jewelry, soft lighting, all those kinds of things, we tend to reject the decay, the aging process. And when it comes to the mental side of things, again, we fail to see the crumbling with those aggregates such as feeling, perceptions, volitional formations. We don't see the tricks that consciousness does to block out certain things and compel us to believe certain things. And they're really wrong view that they arise from. And then when it comes to empty, we don't see empty in the sense of value and substance. So we always assign value and substance to the five aggregates. We don't see the emptiness. We actually think it's worthwhile, that there's something substantial there. It's not void. And we take it as the truth when it's really a lie. There's a deception. So that's what we tend to do through the five aggregates. And then the last one, atta, we actually think this whole construction is worth taking as me and mine. Because of all the other characteristics, we say to ourselves, yeah, this is me and mine. And all these loved ones are mine. There is no unlastingness and no difficulty through dukkha, through the disintegration, none of it. And so when you do the first meditation and the second meditation, yoniso and ayoniso manasikāra, you can use an example. You can use oneself, so you plug yourself into this and you contemplate both the wholesome way and the unwholesome way. You can also use another person, because what's really compelling about these meditations, particularly if you pick a loved one, is that is where it hurts. And that's where the resistance comes in, because that's the part that's very, very difficult to give up. We don't want to leave our loved ones. Even during this coronavirus pandemic, it's very hard for us to go without our loved ones, to not see our loved ones, to not be around our loved ones. And we refuse to see the 11 characteristics in our loved ones. So everyone in the world is made up of these five aggregates. And where tanha arises is when we cling to these five aggregates and identify with them and personalize them. So our loved ones, what we do is we see the unwise part and we create stories and identities and personal, type things in order to almost like lie to ourselves. And so when you use an example of a loved one in this meditation, you'll find that there's a lot of resistance in the meditation. If you persist then and you break through, it's an amazing thing. And you are actually breaking through the concrete bunker that is ignorance. It can also be called the door bar that is blocking us from seeing sakkaya. So in the suttas, Buddha says sakkaya is really misapprehending the five aggregates subject to clinging. So one enters the stream when you start to see these five aggregates of clinging coming out of wrong view, corrupted views, misapprehension. And so this meditation is very, very powerful to break through that. So the third meditation is actually to do the first meditation in a simpler way. So you take the five aggregates in total. So you just consider it as body and mind. And then you go through the 11 characteristics. That can also be done. It's a slightly shorter meditation, but it's still long because you actually have to contemplate quite deeply. My recommendation is actually to spend as much time as possible on each characteristic, so you really get to see it. So if you're taking all five aggregates together as body and mind, one can actually really go quite deeply into it, and they are linked. So when you start to see it, you really start to open it up. And so by the end of it, you really see actually it's not worth taking as mine, because all of these things are unlasting, unstable, subject to arising and passing away, and therefore subject to the whole mass of suffering. I mean, that in a nutshell is really it. And then this fourth meditation is really the simplified version of the second meditation, which is taking all five aggregates in total as body and mind and doing the yoniso manasikāra, the unwise contemplation, to see how we get caught, that this is our usual tendency of thinking. And so when you do it in that way and you spend time on each of the 11 characteristics, you see that where we constantly come from is that we believe out of social convention or wrong views, or even just the environment that we live in, that we think we're lasting. That's not going to come to us. That's what we're always saying to each other. And therefore we think we can have as much happiness as we want. We can maintain good health. There is nothing that is going to fester in us. It doesn't matter how many times we hear people having cancer or being mentally having festering in their minds. No matter how many times we hear it, we reject it. Oh, it's not going to happen to us. It's not going to happen to our loved ones. And what wedges in our mind is all these things that are associated with lust, hate, wrong views, and delusion. But what we think is we have all this wonderful knowledge that is not going to hurt us, not going to lead to the wrong places. And then we deny the misery, we deny affliction, and we try to be as independent as possible. And so we don't really see how much we rely on others and how much at a mental level we rely on these five aggregates. And then when it comes to disintegrating and empty, we refuse to see it. We keep saying that we can make it last, that it is worthwhile, it is valuable, and therefore it's worth taking as me and mine. And so when you really contemplate in this way, even at the collective level of body and mind, without going through each of the five aggregates, you really start to see the truth, which is, in a nutshell, the world we're living in is constantly supporting the wrong view. And when we are with those that are supporting the wrong view, then we sustain that wrong view within us. And so we keep getting duped. Every time we make contact with the world, it keeps duping us. It keeps us within the falsity, the deception. And so Buddha's always saying, make a strong determination towards the truth, towards saccaditthana, this determination for truth, because everything else is a lie. Only Nibbana is the truth. So there are actually more meditations than those 4 that I mentioned, but I'm not going to elaborate any further because I think there's more than enough there to get started. But I would recommend, before even going through those 4 meditations, is actually to do this shorter meditation, which we covered when we looked at the characteristic of empty, suññato, because it's actually very, very quick and very, very penetrative. And it's what the Buddha always tends to ask the monks and tends to ask people in general who are ready to enter the stream. And it's something that can be contemplated whether you have more fruits of the path. And if we go through it, it's just a reminder, because this is the quickest way to actually penetrate the Sīla Sutta. So the short meditation is, if it is impermanent, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and subject to change, vipranama, is it worth taking as me or mine? So impermanent comes when we see the arising, so birth. We create this body, we create this birth. Then it is subject to old age, sickness, and death. So it's not lasting. We see the passing away. And then that is suffering. So we go through pain, sadness, sorrow, lamentation, grief, separation from what is pleasing, united with what is displeasing. We don't get what we want. It's dukkha. So then we see this, that there's this subject to change, that we are constantly aging, decaying, ripening until we die. And so the question we ask is it worth taking as me or mine? The reason we ask this question is because where we're asking it, we're saying actually, if all these characteristics are there, it's empty, it's hollow, it's not valuable, there's no substance there. And so that's why you go to emptiness directly. And one time you do this meditation, you could go to the 4th jhana. Another time you do it, you could go to the 7th jhana. So these mental absorptions, the thing to remember about this meditation is that it can be very quick, very swift, particularly if one is suvacca, one follows the Buddha's instructions. And where this contemplation comes from is really these 11 characteristics, but also in the way that the Buddha talks about it in the suttas. It's the exact same kind of contemplation. And so it's coming from right view, and it's like the medicine that the Buddha is giving us is bitter on the outside. So in order to taste the sweetness of the truth, which is inside, one has to go through the bitterness. So quite often, conventionally, we don't want to talk about old age, sickness, and death. Neither do we want to meditate on it. But one can be pleasantly surprised that when you actually do this meditation, you actually become very settled, very easeful, somewhat relieved, and then very joyful, and then very concentrated. And so this meditation is a very powerful meditation because it lifts the door bar, allows you to see sakkaya, allows you to see that these five aggregates are not worth clinging to. So ābādhato, when we really see that it's not worth taking as me and mine, we're saying it's empty of any self. It's empty of anything belonging to self. And it's not just the words, we really, really see it in the meditation. And so I strongly encourage you, if you have any kind of resistance, fight through the resistance that comes to the mind, not wanting to do this meditation, because there is much fruit to be gained from doing this meditation. And so all I can do is really encourage that you try and persist. And it's really helpful if you know what the characteristics are, so you know what the five aggregate subject to clinging are, because ultimately it all leads to this point. So the more that you have contemplated, even theoretically, what they are, when you go to do this meditation, the truth is actually quite undeniable. And then you realize that a lot of what is around us, a lot of what is being pushed onto us is actually all the deception. And so you no longer want to fall for that deception. You're onto a different track, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And so what that leads to is right knowledge, and then ultimately all the liberations, the right liberations. So we can end the session here. We can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings find the right view. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.